Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now. Last Friday, we passed the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe's longest and largest war since the end of World War II. The conflict has been devastating, with hundreds of thousands of casualties and millions of people displaced. The war has also been surprising. Many experts believed Russia would quickly overwhelm Ukraine's defenses, but of course, Ukraine pushed back and has inflicted many battlefield defeats on the Russians. Still, neither side seems ready to end the fighting. Joining us tonight are three UW experts who will discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine. Jim Gingras is a doctoral student in international relations, and he's also a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. Yoshiko Herrera is professor of comparative politics and international relations and former director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. And Andrew Kydd is also professor of political science and affiliated with the same Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. Thank you all for being here tonight. Andy and Yoshiko have, this is the one-year anniversary probably of their appearance on the show. You gave a lot of very insightful predictions about what might transpire. And Jim, it's great to have you with us tonight as well. Starting things off, leading off is Andrew Kydd, professor of political science and an affiliate of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. His research studies game theoretic analysis of international security issues such as proliferation, terrorism, trust, and conflict resolution. He's published in the American Political Science Review, International Organization, World Politics, and International Security, among other journals. His award-winning book, Trust and Mistrust in International Relations, was published in 2005 by the Princeton University Press. Prior to joining UW-Madison, he taught at the University of California, Riverside and Harvard University. Professor Kydd, thanks for making time for us tonight and sharing your insights on the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's kind of a grim milestone that brings us together again, but thanks again for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking about just sort of setting the stage a little bit by talking about the war over the past year, how it's gone, how we can expect it to continue on into the future, what type of war it is, and also some other issues like that people are worried about, like is there going to be escalation? Is there a possibility for a direct war between NATO and Russia, the United States and Russia, the possibility for nuclear weapons use in this war, and also the role of China. So that's the basic outline of what I'm going to be talking about. And then the other speakers will flesh that out by talking about the role of NATO and other international factors, as well as what's going on domestically in Russia and Ukraine. So if you could advance to the next slide. So the war so far, I put up a map that's from, I believe, yesterday. And just to give us a sense here of what's going on. So a year ago, Russia invaded and along three axes of advance, essentially. One coming down from the north, from Belarus towards Kyiv, the capital, hoping to take the capital and have a short war by overrunning the capital. Two from the east in the so-called Donbass region, the two provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, which they already had occupied a fair amount of. You can see the red in this map, the territory that's marked with red stripes and surrounded by a black line. That's Crimea in the south, and the portions of the Donbass in the east that they had already occupied. They advanced from those areas. And then from the south, coming up north, both to the west towards Kherson and towards the east to link up with the territory that they already held in Donetsk. So those were the three big axes of advance. I won't go through a bunch of maps, but they were initially had a lot more territory than you see here. But the offensives stalled and were eventually beaten back in the north around Kyiv and around Kharkiv as well. But they made a lot of progress in the south, linking up Crimea and the whole sort of stripe of territory along the south east up to the east portion of the country. Then in the summer, well, the Russian offensive sort of stalled out. The Ukrainians built up their military. And then in the summer and fall, there were some Ukrainian counteroffensives that are marked in blue on this map. One in the north near Kharkiv, the second biggest city in Ukraine, where they made a fair amount of progress, driving the Russians back away from Kharkiv. And two, a bit slower, but still significant in the south, where they recaptured the riverside town of Kherson and the whole western bank of the Dnieper River, as you see there. And then things sort of settled down for the winter, and they've been fighting fairly intensely, but not making a lot of progress one way or the other. You may not be able to see it, but there are little green circles where it's called significant fighting in the past 24 hours. And that's around this region in Donetsk and Luhansk, along the very eastern border there of the sort of disputed front lines. You may have heard of the recent fighting there, where the Russians have been hammering Ukrainian positions, and the Ukrainians have been basically holding their own, but gradually giving ground slowly. So that's the war so far. That's where we are now at this point. Next slide. So the kind of war that is being fought now is usually called a war of attrition in the study of war. To distinguish it from two other things, one would be a war of sort of a blitzkrieg war or a war of maneuver, as we saw in World War II, these sort of great big offensives that the Germans launched, and then the Russians sort of learned from them how to do that, where you try to encircle the enemy by punching holes in the enemy's line with your armored forces, and then driving deep into the rear areas and then sort of surrounding them. These sorts of gigantic battles of encirclement. That's not really happening. What we're having is the war of attrition, much more like World War I than World War II. And so the advances are slow, casualties are high. You have battles such as we're seeing in the East now, where the Wagner private military company that has been basically recruiting convicts from Russian prisons and fighting in the Donbass region, they're simply sending them in human wave attacks against defended Ukrainian positions, and so they're getting cut down by Ukrainian machine guns. So very much like World War I rather than World War II, and hence we've had pretty high casualties. I've seen estimates of Russian casualties in the neighborhood of 200,000, maybe a third to a half of those killed. Ukraine less, around 120,000, similar proportions. This sort of war is very artillery intensive, very material intensive. They're firing, or at the peak anyway, are firing 10,000 shells per day, much more than they produce, and so stockpiles are declining. And it's very intensive in terms of manpower as well. They've settled down along that front line. It's about 600 kilometers, much like the Western Front in World War I, where you had a defended line of trenches stretching all the way from the English Channel to the Swiss border, and it hardly moved for years of combat. So my sense is that breakthroughs are unlikely. Even the Ukrainian offensives, which were pretty successful in summer and fall, they weren't sort of the classic, combined arms breakthroughs where you would see armored forces driving, punching big holes and driving forward a long way. They were relatively incremental because neither side is really capable of combined arms warfare at this point. So you'll see territory lost and gained in the next year, but you're unlikely to see some sort of like dazzling military success like Heinz Guderian or something like that, where you see massive breakthrough battles. Next slide. So how do wars of attrition end? And this slide is kind of the same as it was 6 months ago. And the reason it's the same is because these wars take a long time. So the kind of classical conventional war of attrition that we saw in World War I lasted 4 years, but other wars of attrition like Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Iran-Iraq War, those lasted many years as well. How do they end? Oftentimes, one side will give up or collapse. So the United States basically gave up in Vietnam and Afghanistan, went home. Germany ultimately collapsed in World War I. So you can see you can have sort of a loss of desire to continue fighting, or a big sort of large-scale collapse. Russia essentially collapsed in World War I as well in 1917. You can have a negotiated settlement sometimes as two sides exhaust each other. The Korean War was kind of like this in 1953. Essentially, a negotiated settlement ratified the existing front lines that the troops had fought to by that point. Or they can go back to the status quo ante. The Iran-Iraq War of 1980 through 89, that should be 89, not 99, was similar to that. In this case, the Ukrainians are highly motivated to retake all the territory they lost since a year ago and more. They've articulated aims of getting back Crimea, getting back the Donbass, essentially returning to the 1991 borders. They would probably have to win that on the battlefield rather than, I don't see how they're going to negotiate for that, unless there's some domestic collapse within Russia, Putin is overthrown, something along those lines. So the Ukrainians are certainly motivated to fight. Putin appears to be highly motivated to fight as well, for a variety of reasons that I'm sure Professor Herrera will go into. Next slide. So the role of China has attracted a lot of interest recently. China is generally aligned with Russia against the West, against the United States, but so far has not been very supportive of the Russian war effort. You get the sense that they think this was a crazy thing to do, and they wish it had never happened, but they're not quite sure what to do now that it has. Recently, the United States has been warning that China is considering supplying Russia with artillery shells, which could be very important because Russia is running low. And as I mentioned before, it's a very artillery-intensive war. And China is the biggest player out there. I mean, Russia is buying artillery from North Korea. They're getting drones from Iran. But if they actually got China behind them with the Chinese manufacturing capability, that could really turn the tables and solve a lot of Russian materiel problems. So the United States is very much opposed to that and threatening sanctions against China if they were to go that route. China is also, at least diplomatically and publicly, positioned itself as a potential mediator, potential peace plan proponent. They proposed a 12-point peace plan just the other day at the UN. Here's the Chinese representative advancing that plan. And they could be it's fairly effective in that role. They're a very strong country. They're aligned with Russia, and so Russia might listen to them. Sometimes biased mediators are actually quite effective in that regard because they can convince the side that they're biased in favor of to make concessions that other people would not be able to make them convince them to make. So the role of China will be definitely bear watching in the next year as the war continues. Next slide. So finally, the danger of escalation, right? So just quickly, is escalation to a direct NATO-Russia war likely? My answer is no. I think Russia is unlikely to attack NATO with conventional forces because Russia would lose a conventional war with NATO. They're unlikely to attack the West with nuclear weapons because the West has nuclear weapons too, and there would be a very high risk of retaliation and possibly escalation to all-out nuclear war. And the Russians would get the worst of that. They certainly wouldn't want that to happen. But the danger, to my mind, is could Russia use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? And there, I think there's a real possibility that they might. That is, if Putin thought it might frighten Ukraine into surrendering, or if he persuaded himself that they would actually help militarily in some sense. He certainly has no moral constraints against killing people. So I could see him using them in desperation as a sort of last resort. The one saving grace there is the Ministry of Defense in Russia has basically said that Russian nuclear doctrine is unchanged and they would only use them in defense of Russia. If that's actually pushback against Putin and Putin's nuclear threats, that might signal that there is some possibility that Putin might give the order and it wouldn't be carried out, which would be hopeful. The further danger is what if Russia really starts engaging in mass killing? Right, if they start killing hundreds of thousands of people in the territories that they occupy, or they start dropping nuclear weapons on Ukrainian cities, then there would be enormous pressure for NATO to intervene despite the nuclear risks. And so I think that's the most likely scenario for escalation to that level. I think that's it. So I will leave it there and pass it on to Jim.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. We'll be back with questions for you shortly. Our next guest, as you indicated, is Jim Gingras, who's a doctoral student studying international relations and alliances. Jim's a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel and military diplomat. He's particularly interested in the NATO alliance and methods that may improve U.S. and international security policy. His leadership and diplomatic experiences include commanding a squadron and installation in Turkey, serving with foreign allies as the assistant air attaché in London, and leading combat missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's also been an instructor at both the French and U.S. Air Force academies. Jim, it is great to have you at UW-Madison and great to have you with us tonight. Please share your thoughts on the situation.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And likewise, I'm honored to be here and very happy to be speaking to this wonderful community. So I also, like Andy, wish it were under better circumstances, but I think this is a really important topic for the whole world to be aware of what's going on and really to understand the significance of this world-changing event that we're living through right now. So with that, I'd be happy to walk through my presentation, and I'm going to look to answer these kind of 4 questions and really, in a very brief manner, talk about these in some detail. But if you are more details, I'm more than happy to answer in the Q&A session. And I really could talk about this stuff for hours. I think I was talking to someone earlier that this would be like 2 or 3 lessons if I was teaching my classes at the academy. And this is going to be in just a very brief few minutes here that I'll go through this. But answering these 4 questions, I'm going to start with the NATO question and kind of where that is, who they are, where they are, and how that is evolving, and then looking at what we're doing to supply the fight in Ukraine to help our partner there to beat back the Russian invasion, and then how that might change for the future. And then finally, we'll talk about just the way things are changing inside the alliance, both for a couple members that are NATO alliance members, and then one that is an applicant with Germany, Turkey, and Sweden. So with that, I'm going next slide, please. Okay, so this question, what is NATO's role and has NATO become more unified? Well, the short answer is, yeah, absolutely. This has been something I don't think Putin had predicted at all, and it has been the opposite effect. We are more allied, more aligned, and we have a 30-nation alliance that is tighter than I've ever seen it and perhaps ever has been before. So we have definitely some things that we need to be aware of, because there are definitely some challenges. But at the same time, really, it's important to realize that this is a large alliance, and we have a lot of things that are going on, and we're doing all these things in support of both the alliance and then also the deterrent effect to stop Russia from going any further and to supply as much as we can to our Ukrainian partners. So with that, I want to talk about the order of battle, which is kind of military parlance for where things are, who's where, what do we have. And I just thought it'd be useful for everyone, in case you're not aware of kind of the things that are going on for NATO itself. It's useful to understand how we are arrayed across the battlefield, across the eastern flank of Europe, and to see where all those are. So we'll take a look first at the ground and see how things look for the different ground units, and then switch into the air. As a retired Air Force guy, I'm partial to making sure that we include all of the domains. So we can go to the next slide, please. So you can see this is a busy slide, and apologies, but really there's a lot going on. And the biggest takeaway from this is to realize that this is a rotational presence. And so we have the host nation forces that are arrayed across Eastern Europe, but then we also have up in the Baltics, for example, the enhanced forward presence. And since 2014, we've been doing this on a rotational basis, and it is a nonstop rotation of allied forces going in, being there to support our allied partners, as well as to be there in case of anything going on. We all have skin in the game. This is an alliance that includes 30 nations, and all of us have a role to play in this deterrent effect here that we are working on in the eastern part of Europe. So this is the ground forces. These are the ground forces and the naval forces. You can see we have 40,000 troops under NATO command at any one time. That's not only the troops that are there. We have a whole lot. In fact, 100,000 those are U.S., but they are not directly under NATO command. And so the command and control is an important aspect to this, with some forces being under domestic leadership, under their host nation, their country's flag, able to go under NATO if needed, but 40,000 are dedicated to NATO at any given moment. And that's across the entire theater. So we can go to the next slide, and we can see that in the air, we also have that similar presence all the time, always flying overhead. We have a whole lot of aircraft. We don't have numbers here, but we have locations, and you can see just a general idea that this is a really active deterrent effect that's going on. So although we are not engaged in direct combat, which is a very good thing, we do have a lot going on that allows us to one, be aware of what's going on, two, help our partners and allies, and three, really serve as that deterrent effect. So with that understanding of where the battlefield is for NATO and how NATO is set up to be able to respond to any direct or hostile threat from anywhere, really, it's important to turn back now, looking inward to the US. And so we'll look at the things that the United States has already offered or given to Ukraine. So we can go to the next slide. We can see that this is a huge amount, and the total number is 30 billion just in this year alone. And $30 billion for someone who served in the DoD, for the Department of Defense, for 20 plus years, I can tell you that's a lot of money. And that's also money that was not allocated before. And so when we're looking at a kind of comparison, when we were in Afghanistan, the amount of military assistance we provided to the Afghans, the highest in any one year was $9 billion. So we're talking about more than 3 times the amount we gave to Afghanistan, we're now giving to Ukraine, which is, in my opinion, a great number. Yes, we can always do more. Yes, it'd be great. But it right now has been a question of what does the Ukrainian military need? What is the most effective? What can provide the biggest effect for them? And making sure we provide that need, provide for that need, and give them the kind of equipment that they really are in desperate need of. And so in the beginning, that looked like all the stuff that we had collected from the Cold War era. We went in the warehouses, dusted off all the old stuff, and got it out the door as fast as possible. Why? Because it's the stuff that they were already using in their own arsenal. They had already had the equipment, the training, they had the background to be able to put it to play right away. And so the things that we were able to get to them had the biggest impact. And now, since unfortunately the war has gone on a little bit longer, we've looked at the bigger systems. And so if you notice on the air defense, you can see we gave them a Patriot missile battery. That is huge. We're talking about $1 billion piece of equipment that is really complicated. A couple of countries also offered to kick in and do that. So it's not just a US effort. This is across the NATO alliance. We are giving materiel and supplies and making sure that we get it to the Ukrainian forces as fast as we possibly can. So honestly, this is just a quick snapshot, but it is a huge number and a huge amount of money that we are supporting with this. And yes, we can do more. And in fact, there are some things we could do in the future. And if we look at the next slide, we can see that this is a picture I took of the Air Force Thunderbirds. And so we wouldn't give them the Thunderbirds, but we would give them potentially F-16s. Now, the president has said for the moment that's off the table, but that could absolutely be something as we were looking at a longer term engagement. So as Andy mentioned, it is looking like it's going to be a longer protracted war. So as we are looking to have the more complicated schemes of maneuver to be able to bring in more complicated effects to the battlefield, things like the F-16 or the other 4th generation aircraft could provide a really important change to the war. However, it's important to realize that's a really expensive piece of equipment, and each one of those aircraft are really expensive. And when we only have about 10 billion left for the year, we got to decide how we're going to spend that to the greatest effect, the greatest positive effect to help shape the war in Ukraine's favor. And that may be the case in the future as we look to field those, but it'll be, a year, year and a half, maybe 2 years between the time that we give them that and when they might be able to get it to the battlefield. So that gives you kind of an overview of what NATO has done and what we have done to supply the fight. But now it's important to look inward to the alliance and talk about 3 key members of the alliance, or soon to be members of the alliance. So the first one I want to talk about is Germany. And so Chancellor Scholz, almost a year ago, in fact, a year ago yesterday, I believe it was, he gave his very famous speech, which has been termed the Zeitenwende. And the Zeitenwende, German for a watershed moment, a turning point. It is truly a 180 on the German defense policy, and something that I served in Germany for a few years, and I've been with the German military. They're great. I love them, but I never expected the kind of change that we saw last year. And that, just very briefly, is a 2%. They are committing to that 2014 Wales summit, saying they'd get to 2%. Well, now it's very explicit. They're getting to 2%. They are now starting to provide lethal weapons outside of the country, and the fact that they gave the Leopard tanks to the Ukrainian forces, they have committed that. That is, again, huge. The last time the German tanks were rolling in Ukraine, it was a really bad time. So this now is the opposite. And now we're seeing a really good thing that the Leopards are going into the battlefield in Ukraine. So honestly, this has been a 180 shift, and it's been a very welcome shift. And honestly, I would love to talk more about that. But the other part about this that's so important is that you have two different organizations. You have NATO, the military alliance, and the European Union, which is a great international organization that is doing similar but different things. And this war has crystallized the roles and how the force for NATO has been really about the military execution. The force for EU has been the sanctions and economics and being able to flow those supplies through. And that working together, that partnership has been one that's been really heartening for me, someone on the outside looking in. It is something that could have gone the other way, but it has been a really strong partnership. And it's also important to realize, looking back again at that nuclear threat, so the German choice into how they are going to move forward, it's important to realize that when they look around, they see all their closest allies. They see France, the United Kingdom, the United States. All three of those are nuclear powers. Germany is the only one that's not. And so Germany, I believe, has made a significant choice to ally itself and make sure that they have the right equipment that they're able to use in case of nuclear war. And so they are looking at the United States and making sure we are in lockstep, that the United States and Germany is moving together in the same direction for the defense posture. And then in doing that, they have prioritized NATO and the US relationship over the relationship in the European Union, rather, between Germany and France, and the idea that the European Union wanted to have the strategic autonomy to be able to operate independently. That's important still, but right now that's not Germany's focus. And what we've seen is this conflict, this war has really crystallized their ability to move forward and make sure they're staying in lockstep with us. So it's been a great sign in Germany. Now things may change, and it is definitely a challenge to spend all the money they're trying to spend. So we're going to see some fits and starts, and they're going to probably say yes and then no and then yes, and it's going to be halting, but it's going to be forward progress nonetheless. And so that's kind of the hub of where things are changing in the north. Now looking to the south and east, we see our perhaps most challenging ally. But I think it's important for all the listeners and viewers to hear that Turkey is a huge partner in NATO. In fact, they are the second largest army in NATO after the United States. And so because they have such a huge role, it's important to understand all the things that are going on. And one of the most key things that many Americans don't realize is that they have been involved in a protracted war against the PKK, a terrorist organization. The United States has designated a terrorist organization. It's the Kurdish insurgency, and they have been fighting. The Kurds and the Turks have been fighting for over 40 years now. Tens of thousands of people have died. Tens of thousands of people, and unfortunately, there's still a significant fight going. In the last 7 or 8 years, there's been nearly 2,000 people killed, and so it's definitely an intense conflict. And the Turkish concerns that the Kurdish fighters, who we say are terrorists, the PKK, they believe are also working in Syria, and some have moved to other countries. And that has been their primary sticking point. And so they really have been against things like the United States supporting the YPG, which is also Kurdish fighters in Syria. The Turks say that they are the same as PKK. We say, no, they're different. They're on the different side of the border, different group of Kurdish fighters. Turkey's not so sure, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in the next slide. But sorry, I can go back slide. Yeah, the other thing to consider is that right now, the Turkish president, Recep Erdogan, so President Erdogan is about to be up for re-election again in possibly May, depends on how things go, but they are struggling to recover after the horrible disaster. Nearly 50,000 people died, and yet they are going to go forward with an election here very soon. So it's ironic, sad, but ironic that when Erdogan came to power in 1999, it was in response to a horrible Turkish government response to another earthquake. And so again, tens of thousands of people were killed, and his party rode to power as a result of the poor response. Now we're seeing the same kind of thing in Turkey right now, where the Turkish government is blaming the builders, but it's also the Turkish government's responsibility to make sure that the building codes are enforced properly. And having lived there for a while, I can tell you that it is definitely a challenge, and it's something we could talk about more in Q&A, but those domestic politics play a big role as to what Turkey thinks in the wider NATO conversation and how they're supporting the potential application or the potential acceptance of our next round of allies coming in. And we go to the next slide here and see that Sweden, obviously one of the two applicants for the next round to go from 30 to 32, Sweden has been a huge proponent of non-alignment and not getting involved militarily. Over 2 centuries, since 1815, they have said, no, we are not getting involved. But the existential threat they feel from this Russian invasion, they realize that, you know what, we are not safe. And in fact, when I visited Sweden last summer, I spoke with a senior government official, and that senior government official told me, the thing that really got to us was when your president said, we will defend every inch of NATO. And that's when they looked around and realized, we're not NATO. And that's one of the motivators for them to then apply, along with Finland, to join the alliance. And that would take us from 30 to 32 members. Unfortunately, going back to those concerns from Turkey, what the Swedes have said is, okay, Turkey has asked for a number of people to be extradited from Sweden that Turkey says are terrorists, and they want to be extradited back to Turkey so that they can prosecute them. Sweden has said, no, show us the evidence and we will extradite them with enough evidence. And they feel that they have that question has gone all the way to the Supreme Court, and that question has not been sufficiently resolved. So unfortunately, Turkey now is left frustrated and is unable to be able to get what they want, and Sweden is unwilling to resolve. So there's now going to have to be some sort of negotiation or brokering. And I believe that it's going to be the United States that steps in. We are going to offer some concession potentially to Turkey. And I believe eventually, ultimately, Turkey will accept both Sweden and Finland into the alliance because they bring in these new capabilities and these really strong, great technologies that are going to help the alliance with the interoperability, with the ability to work better as an overall organization. I believe Turkey will acquiesce, and it may take some more prodding from the US, but or others, but I believe they will eventually accept Sweden in. So with that, I'll go back and leave you with my final takeaway, and that is really important to understand. Although NATO is not in this fight directly, we are absolutely supporting, and it is a challenge, and a consensus-based organization with 30 different ideas is always going to be hard. And yet, it is still the single best alliance in the history of humankind. Truly an amazing organization that is doing some great things, led by the US, supported by everyone. In fact, the US could never do this alone. It is only with the support of our allies that we're able to do this, because that alliance structure is what makes NATO different and better than everything else. And so without it, I guarantee we would have had a much worse outcome with Putin being able to do more because he felt that he could do it. But because NATO is there, because that deterrence is there, he has been relatively, unfortunately not enough, but relatively constrained. And so this collective security that's provided by this transatlantic, this Euro-Atlantic alliance, that transatlantic bond is indelible, and we will stand. And we've heard it from senior administration officials from this country, from all the other countries around the alliance, that we are not going to go anywhere, that this alliance will stay and be there for Ukraine as long as it takes. So with that, I turn it back over, and I look forward to your questions and answers.
Thank you, Jim. That was terrific. Great to hear an insider's view of how NATO works, too, and its importance to the world. Our final guest tonight is Yoshiko Herrera. Her work studies Russian politics, nationalism, identity, and ethnic politics, political economy and state statistics, and international norms. Professor Herrera's work has appeared in numerous outlets, including Cambridge University Press, Cornell University Press, Perspectives on Politics, Comparative Politics, Political Analysis, Social Science Quarterly, and Post-Soviet Affairs, one of my favorite journals. At UW-Madison, Herrera teaches courses on comparative politics, social identity, and post-communist politics. And before coming to Madison in 2007, she was the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard. She's also the former director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia here at UW-Madison. Professor Herrera, great to have you back, and I really look forward to your outlook on the situation.
Great. Thank you so much. I will try to move a bit quickly in order to save time for questions. I'm going to talk about domestic politics in Ukraine and Russia, what's happening in each of those countries and how that impacts the war. Let's start with Ukraine first. And I'm going to make 4 points about Ukraine. The first thing is that there is a great deal of unity in Ukraine right now. If you look back through Ukrainian history, you might see discussion of divides, regional divides, linguistic, ethnic divides, etc. But Ukraine, especially since 2014, has created a very strong sense of a multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-everything sense of Ukrainian national identity. So the country is very united in the goal of protecting its sovereignty and nationhood. Right now, there's extremely strong support for the president, Zelensky, and this unity is one of the reasons that they are very motivated to keep fighting. Next slide. Second thing that's happened in Ukraine is that the exact opposite of Putin's goals have taken place. So these two graphics show Ukrainian views on NATO and the EU going back to 2008. And if you just look at 2008, you can see the red and yellow lines were support for military alliance with Russia and CIS countries. That's the red line. And neutrality is the yellow line. The blue line on the left is support for NATO. And you can see that in 2008, it was just a little bit over 15%. After 2014, it went up dramatically. It was in the 40%. And right now, this graphic on the right goes up to 2022. It was over 60%, but it's now gone up to over 70%. So the one thing that Putin did not want, which was Ukraine to move westward, to join the EU, to join NATO, etc., his intervention and invasion of Crimea and intervention in the Donbass since 2014, not to mention his meddling in Ukrainian elections going back even further, and also this war that started a year ago has really pushed Ukraine into a very anti-Russian, pro-Europe, pro-NATO position. And that's just actually an amazing achievement for a dramatic shift in public opinion in just a short time. Next, Ukraine has also really changed its views on democracy quite dramatically, even since 2019. The number of people supporting democracy has gone way up. You may think that that's normal, but actually cross-nationally, there's a lot of mixed views on supporting democracy, and also in particular on whether or not you would support your party if they were going to do something slightly undemocratic in order to win. A lot of people might think themselves Democrats, but they're willing to adhere to transgressions if it would help their side. Ukrainians have moved away from that towards a more full-throated support of democracy. And President Zelensky has actually also taken steps to reduce corruption, even during this war, even firing actually a childhood friend and advisor of his during the war. Next slide. Okay, and the final thing I want to say about Ukraine and how it relates to their motivation is Russian occupation for Ukrainians, for anybody really, is not what we understand as peace. As Russian territory that had been occupied, Russia has been liberated. You see evidence of war crimes and atrocities. This picture is a picture of Bucha from last spring. Even since then, there are other stories like this in Kharkiv, around Kherson, and Russia continues to target civilians through air attacks on buildings, infrastructure, electricity, etc. More recently, there's been a lot of reporting about the deportation, the forced deportation of children from Ukraine, orphans, into Russia. And this, rather than being secret, this is something that Russian government officials have actually bragged about. And one official herself, quote, adopted a child. And this is actually something that fits the legal definition of genocide. So the forced deportation of children, on top of the other kinds of atrocities, make the continued occupation of territory by Russia in Ukraine unacceptable for most Ukrainians. And that's why I think the likelihood of Ukrainians agreeing to an immediate ceasefire or agreeing to cede territory to Russia is so unlikely. Next, let's just turn to the Russian side of things. The first thing maybe people are already aware of is that Vladimir Putin maintains a lot of support. We don't really know the true level of his support because he's cracked down on society so much that only people who are already pro-Putin supporters answer the polls these days. And polls no longer report non-response rates, so we can presume that the people who are responding are pro-government. But in any case, there's a lot of indications that he does have a lot of support. I think something that's worth noting is that Putin is absolutely committed to fighting, and he is just, in all of his public speeches, just seething with resentment. This sense of victimhood, righteous victimhood, that Russia has been wrong, the international system has done these wrong things to Russia, and Russia is therefore justified in fighting. He is indifferent to the costs. He says things like, well, better to die in the battlefield than just to die as an alcoholic. The level of compensation, let alone acknowledgement of loss to families in Russia, remains just abysmally low. And I don't think there's any evidence at this point that Putin has changed his mind or that he's willing to back down voluntarily. So I think the idea that Putin will suddenly see the light and realize his mistake is just very unlikely to happen. Next slide. Unfortunately, the Russian public remains very passive. The upper picture is a picture of a so-called rally. Now, we know that there's a lot of government pressure on people to come, that they bus people in from regions, etc. But nevertheless, there's virtually no large-scale or even very small-scale public opposition in Russia right now. Almost nobody has resigned from the government. And I would say there's a lot of evidence that fear and fatalism, a sense of fear and fatalism, are very widespread in society. Alexei Navalny, an opposition leader, is there in jail. He is wasting away in jail, and people understand that fighting against the regime is likely to lead to arrest or jail, and that's one of the reasons for the sense of fear. But nevertheless, people do not have a sense of agency, that they can work together, that they can overcome the government's tactics, etc. And so this leads to a kind of passivity, and I think a very low likelihood of any kind of social revolution or even elite-led coup. On this point, next slide, I want to note that today is the anniversary of the murder of Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered 8 years ago today, right outside the Kremlin. Nemtsov was a 1990s Democrat. He was a physicist. He was a governor, one of the youngest governors of a Russian region, Nizhny Novgorod. He served as a deputy prime minister under President Yeltsin. And he became not only a critic of Putin, but a critic of the Chechen Wars and a strong critic of the Crimean invasion in 2014. And his murder, being gunned down just steps from the Kremlin, was another of the signals that Putin sent over his 23-year reign, that he wouldn't tolerate any kind of dissent. It's not that Nemtsov was so popular in the population, but that he was a critic of Putin, which was the problem. Okay, finally and quickly, moving on to sanctions. I just want to note that the sanctions are unprecedented in terms of scale, scope, and speed. They're a massive undertaking, and in addition to hitting key parts of the economy, there's personal sanctions, and very importantly, the Central Bank of Russia has been cut off from $300 billion in its foreign currency reserves, which Ambassador William Taylor on Friday suggested would be something that should be looked at as a source for reparations. Whether Russia wants to commit to that or not, that's something the international community can work on. But I think what most people understand is that sanctions, even though they are very important in changing the nature of the Russian economy for decades to come, they largely did not affect sales of oil and gas, and that has allowed the Russian government largely to keep bringing in money to support the war effort. Next slide. For this reason, I think that some people have the view that everything is fine in Russia in terms of the economy. The sanctions haven't really worked. But whereas the ruble has strengthened against the dollar, the energy sector continues, there's still food on the shelves, and GDP hasn't shrunk that much. Those indicators do not really tell the full story. For one thing, the Russian government no longer releases data on exports, on investment, key components of GDP, and the ruble is artificially inflated. There's been essentially a massive deglobalization of the Russian economy, and the Russian government is somewhat constrained now because the ruble is no longer a floating currency, and so they're going to eventually run out of money, and this because of the outlays for the war, etc. And this budget deficit is going to continue to grow, which is going to be inflationary. So, and there's also indications of the quality of life, the access to things like dental supplies, medical supplies, etc., are hitting Russians. Not to mention iPhones and foreign cars, etc. But I think the key takeaway is that Russia is back to the Soviet Union in terms of state intervention in the economy. The state is really the only player, but whereas the Soviets at least had a developmental model, at this point, the only model for economic development in Russia is loyalty to the regime, and that's going to bring with it all the inefficiencies and mistakes of communism. Okay, finally, just to conclude, Ukraine is going to win this war, but it's going to be at great cost. This is a picture just from today's Washington Post in Bakhmut. It's just completely desolate. If you've seen the movie All Quiet on the Western Front, it's just echoes of that. So there's just a lot of damage in Ukraine. There's estimates of up to $1 trillion in damage. But nevertheless, for the reasons I outlined earlier, I think Ukraine remains motivated, united, and is going to continue to fight to push Russia out of its territory. Meanwhile, I think that Putin is going to continue until he is militarily defeated. But Russia, even after this war, is facing a very dim future because Putin's policies and the sanctions have really destroyed the Russian economy for years to come. Okay, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
We are going on the record on the show again, and I'll tell you, last time you went on the record, and it was very accurate. You predicted that this would be a huge problem for Putin, and that has certainly proven to be the case. Question from Charles Weiss. He asks, ultimately, Ukraine is unlikely to push Russia back to the borders if they don't strike into Russia itself. So that's an assertion, but it seems perhaps plausible. Why is there such reluctance for Ukraine to strike directly into Russia? I think they've done a bit of that, but seems pretty restrained. Who wants to take that? Jim?
Sure, I'll be happy to give just a quick answer. Honestly, the answer, in my opinion, is that Russian doctrine says a threat on the motherland, on the Russian homeland, means that they are going to respond with nuclear weapons. So a direct, deliberate attack inside Russia on a significant scale, I believe, has a much higher chance of triggering a nuclear response. Not a guarantee, but it's definitely, without question, in my opinion, an escalatory response.
Any other thoughts on that?
I think that's right. And I think you also don't want to raise Russian support for the war. I think you don't have a lot of opposition in the streets, but what you do have is a lot of apathy and people hiding and running away and not showing up for the draft and things like that. You want to make it as clear as possible that this is Russia attacking Ukraine and not vice versa. So occasionally they'll blow up something, a chemical plant, via sabotage, but they don't want to make it look like they're striking into Russia, I think, politically speaking.
Great. Stuart Feldman asks, why are many Southern Hemisphere countries not supporting Ukraine over Russia? Professor Herrera, you want to start?
Yeah, I think that there is a sense of this is a repeat in certain ways of the Cold War between the West and Russia, and these terms like non-aligned countries, etc. There's a sense in which this is not India's war, this is not Brazil's war, this is not the war of a number of countries in the Southern Hemisphere. They have other issues. They have environmental concerns. They have economic issues. They have a number of things that they would like to talk about. And this war is taking up a tremendous amount of the conversation space in international relations right now. It's also very disruptive to other countries in terms of food and supply chain issues. So I think that it's not so much that they're on Russia's side per se, but they don't have a great sense of why they should be pulled into this in the way that people in Europe or the United States think about it.
Maybe to help bring it to an end, but
yeah, possibly.
But there's a lot of self-interest too, I think, in terms of taking oil on the cheap, and these countries are pretty desperate for that, I would say. Any other thoughts on that question?
Well, two things. One, I would say the whole, like, part of the narrative or part of the reason, motivation to help Ukraine is the notion that this is a democratic state being attacked brutally by this authoritarian regime. But that doesn't necessarily play well in other parts of the world where authoritarianism is kind of common and democracy is maybe rare or suspect or fragile. But on the other hand, like, broadly speaking, I mean, which would you rather have the United States and NATO on your side and a bunch of fence sitters in China, like, saying nice things but not actually doing much for you? I mean, I'd rather take Ukraine's side of that any day. Russia is once again isolated as it was during the Cold War, and the fact that some people are sitting out is not a big deal, frankly.
I just want everyone on our side. I mean, don't we?
Sure, but
I think the notion of territorial sovereignty is something that other countries understand. The idea that a stronger country should just invade its neighbor whenever it feels like because it doesn't respect their sovereignty, I think is an argument that a lot of other countries do understand. But as Professor Kydd said, the promotion of democracy per se isn't maybe the strongest argument in some other places. And just the other thing is that there is a kind of background anti-imperialism, anti-US sentiment in some countries. So I think that also feeds into maybe the lackluster response in some places.
Question from William Schmitz. Why is Russia/Putin not honoring the NATO-Russia Founding Act from 1997, where Russia pledged not to threaten or use force against NATO allies and any other state? Because he's Putin?
Well, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so
right.
and he's annexed parts of it, and so he's basically saying, like, A, we're defending our own territory, and B, Ukraine is not in NATO.
Yeah, he's made more specific pledges to respect Ukrainian sovereignty, which he's completely violated as well. So I think he's actually done even more specific things against his pledges. I think for Putin, international law was never a particularly strong constraint, or even domestic law within Russia.
And remember, too, Ukraine was birthed the third largest nuclear state in the world. And so they gave up their nuclear weapons with the express understanding that they would not be attacked. And yet here they are.
Right.
What's the Russian media position on things these days?
Terrible. They have gone absolutely full, trying to think of a polite term. They're 100% in favor of Putin and the war. They throw out crazy narratives about Nazism, about drug addicts, about just all manner of nonsense. They call the war crimes and atrocities. On the one hand, they say those are fake pictures. On the other hand, they blame Ukrainians for having committed the same atrocities. So it's a mishmash of lies, essentially. But unfortunately, a lot of people who are pro-Putin, they actually, they don't turn away from those lies. They fit their views because they're consistent with things that the president is saying.
Yeah, that seems to be a trend that even extends beyond Russia, where people want to hear good things about their side, and that's really, they'd rather hear that than the truth.
Right.
We're not even immune to that in this country, I think. Given the nuclear response risk, how do you think Russia can be defeated militarily?
I think it's just like, sorry, Jim, do you want to go ahead?
No, please go ahead.
I think it's a slow grinding, mile by mile sort of progress, and nothing so dramatic. You don't want to present him with some big, crisis. You just want to make it step by step, drip by drip, and hopefully, because it's incremental, there will be no point where he says, "All right, I'm just going to use nuclear weapons now," because he will still have some remaining hope that he could reverse it through calling up more forces or something like that. I think in that sense, like the lack of maneuver may actually be beneficial because it doesn't present Putin with this sort of existential choice between defeat and escalation in such a sharp way.
Mm.
And if I may, I mean, I've been watching the situation for a while, as many of you have as well. I can tell you that I have been absolutely blown away, impressed by the heroic bravery, the tenacity, the ability to say, you know what, it doesn't matter. This is an existential threat, and the Ukrainian forces are stepping up in a way that I never could have even hoped for before. Honestly, I thought it was going to be like an insurgency. We'd have to switch to an insurgency where they wouldn't be able to maintain even a country, but they are maintaining a country. They're maintaining a military. And because they're maintaining a military, we're able to give them more complicated weapons and material that we can then help them expand the war and take the fight to Russia in a way that I think they have a real chance at winning, because they have such amazing resilience and ability to go the whole way, because they know what's at stake and they're willing to do it. And I think we need to support that until it's done.
Yeah, I just want to add that this spring offensive is going on. And I think that we don't really know what the Ukrainian strategy is. They're sort of moving second. And I think there's a lot of, intelligence reasons for not saying exactly what they're going to do. But I guess like maybe this will be wrong in the future, but I think that there's some opportunities. This offensive carries risks for both sides, and that presents also an opportunity for some kind of breakthrough. So I guess maybe that's wishful thinking, but I think that Ukrainians have shown over and over that they are trying to fight this war in the smartest way possible. And so I think that gives me a little bit of hope for some potential breakthrough. But I just want to emphasize that the foreign, the European and American support is so important, but also the speed is very important. And I think that's the thing that you hear over and over from the Ukrainian side, is that they really appreciate the long-term support, but they also really need the weapons and supplies as soon as possible.
Great. Well, we are at the top of the hour. I will give any of you who wants a final parting thought with our audience a chance to add that now.
I'd just make one point. There's been a lot of debate, and there's been debate in Congress just today, I think, and yesterday, about funding for the Ukraine war and why we should spend the money on it, which gets to the core question of what is the United States' interest here? Why should we be involved? And I would make 2 points. Number one, you've got a nation of 40 million people, a democratic nation, fighting for their survival against a brutal invasion from an authoritarian neighbor. I think that enough engages America's support for democracy, America's sort of sense of itself, that if we don't support that, we've sort of, I think, lost our way in terms of our moral compass. But number two, at a more pragmatic level, where do you want to stop Russia? Right? Do you want to stop them where they are now, or do you want to stop them once they've got Ukraine, or once they've got Moldova, or once they've got somewhere else? Right? The whole Cold War was fought with the Russians on the inter-German border, where there was a real possibility that if they launched an invasion, they'd be at the English Channel in 2 weeks. That was a precarious situation. You don't want to go back to that situation. So I think if you've got an authoritarian leader who's quite aggressive like Putin, you want to stop them as soon as you can. And this is a good place to stop them from purely military, practical reasons.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. Very informative show, and I appreciate your willingness to be on and, make some bold predictions, and, may they be right. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know I sure learned a lot tonight. One, the Ukrainian sense of national identity getting stronger. I think that's really important. Ukraine more aligned with the West than ever before. NATO being such a good alliance, and if anything, getting stronger through this. All that sort of bodes well, I guess, for our side in this conflict, and probably isn't what Putin expected when he launched the invasion. So hopefully Ukraine will win that war of attrition slowly and nothing escalates. But interesting thoughts tonight for sure. Thanks for joining us this evening. We'll be back again on March 14th, and we'll have Tom Erickson as our guest host. Tom is the founding director of the Center for Computer, Data, and Information Sciences, and he's going to moderate a conversation on artificial intelligence for us, because I certainly don't know enough about that topic. And if you can, be sure to join the UW Now events that we'll be having in person around the country. We'll be in Naples next month, and soon after we're in Chicago, Washington, D.C., Silicon Valley, New York, and the Twin Cities going into the spring. So thanks for being with us tonight. Hope you enjoyed the program, and we'll be back again on March 14th. Thank you.
Welcome to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, purveyor of Midwestern values. Values like a hard day's work, lending a helping hand, being a friendly neighbor, spending time with family, staying close to home, enjoying the simpler things in life, and living with integrity. It's these values that make a Badger unstoppable.